Millionaire marries his newly hired maid on a bet, but what he discovers on his wedding night leaves. The Montero mansion was alive with the kind of laughter that belonged only to the powerful. Crystal chandeliers bathed the lavish ballroom in golden light, the clinking of glasses harmonizing with the murmur of Manhattan's elite. Arthur Montero, the man of the hour, stood with an air of unshakable confidence, a glass of whiskey resting between his fingers as he scanned the room. This was his world, one built on money, power, and an unspoken hierarchy where only the exceptional survived. Arthur was a man who had never known defeat. At 36, he was a titan in the business world, his name synonymous with wealth, influence, and an undeniable charm that made him both envied and feared. He had inherited an empire from his father, but unlike other trust fund heirs, he had multiplied his fortune tenfold. He had mastered the art of control, of business, of people, of situations. And tonight was no different. Thomas Serrano, his oldest friend and greatest adversary, approached with a smug smile, the kind that foreshadowed trouble. Thomas was the only man in Arthur's circle who dared to challenge him. And tonight, he was about to do just that. "Arthur," Thomas drawled, swirling the red wine in his glass, "you're always saying that money can buy anything. Power, influence, even love. But tell me, can money really change a person?" Arthur smirked, unfazed. "Of course it can. Money is the great equalizer. It can turn a nobody into a somebody, a beggar into royalty. Given the right circumstances, anything can be transformed." Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "You say that so easily. But I wonder, have you ever put your theory to the test?" Arthur's brow arched slightly. "What are you getting at, Serrano?" Thomas leaned in, his voice lowering into a tone meant for mischief. "A bet, a real test of your so-called power. Marry a woman outside of our social circle. Someone completely opposite of the women you chase. Someone utterly unrefined, unattractive by society's standards. Take her as your wife and transform her. Make the world believe she's one of us. And keep her by your side for 3 months." A slow murmur of amusement spread through their circle. Several guests turned their attention toward them, eager to see how Arthur would respond. His pride was his greatest weapon and his greatest weakness. He never backed down from a challenge. Arthur exhaled, setting his glass down on the marble bar. "That's ridiculous. You expect me to marry a woman just to prove a point?" Thomas grinned. "Oh, I expect you to do more than that. I expect you to prove that money truly is omnipotent. If it is, you should have no trouble making an unworthy woman the toast of high society." 3 months. Arthur. No backing out, no explanations. Convince the world your marriage is real. Transform her, and at the end, she'll walk away with a fortune. But if you fail, well, let's say you'll owe me a significant sum. Arthur narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly do I get if I succeed?" Thomas took a leisurely sip of his wine before answering. $5 million. The room went silent, even for a man as wealthy as Arthur. $5 million wasn't a sum to scoff at. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about proving a point, about winning. Arthur chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. "And who, exactly, would I be marrying?" Thomas scanned the room before his eyes landed on a figure in the distance, a woman moving carefully through the crowd. Her presence so inconspicuous that she was practically invisible. "Her," he said, tilting his head toward the young woman carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Arthur followed his gaze and frowned. Maria. She was his maid, a woman whose existence he barely acknowledged. And yet now, she was the center of the most ridiculous bet he'd ever heard. Maria was plain by society's standards. Her features were delicate but unremarkable. Her figure modestly hidden beneath the practical uniform she wore every day. Her light brown hair was always pulled back into a neat bun. And her posture was that of someone who had spent her life blending into the background. Arthur let out a short laugh. You must be joking. Thomas grinned. She's perfect. No one would ever expect you to marry her. Which makes this challenge all the more delicious. You say money can change anyone? Let's see if it can change her. The guests around them leaned in, waiting for Arthur's response. He could feel their amusement, their curiosity, and most of all, their expectations. They wanted to see if the great Arthur Montero would take the bait. If he would risk his reputation for the sake of proving a point. Pride warred with logic. This was a game, a gamble that should have been beneath him. And yet, the idea of proving Thomas wrong, of showing the world that he could turn even the most ordinary woman into someone worthy of standing beside him, was too tempting to resist. Arthur picked up his glass, took a slow sip of whiskey, and then smirked. Fine, 3 months with her. I'll make her unrecognizable. And when I win, I'll enjoy spending your money. Thomas extended his hand. Arthur shook it firmly, sealing the deal. Across the room, Maria continued working, oblivious to the wager that had just turned her into the center of a high-stakes game. What would you do if your fate was decided by a single conversation? If, in a matter of seconds, you went from invisible to the centerpiece of a game played by the elite? Maria has no idea that her life is about to change forever. Nor does she realize that what starts as a bet will soon unravel emotions neither she nor Arthur expected. Will Maria remain just another piece in Arthur's game, or will she prove to be more than he ever anticipated? Will Arthur truly succeed in transforming her, or will the biggest transformation happen within himself? This is not just a story about power, wealth, and social status. It is a story about change, about redemption, and about the unexpected ways love finds us when we least expect it. Continue the journey, and discover what happens when a reckless bet turns into something far more dangerous, something real. What do you think will happen next? Would you take a bet that could change your life forever? Share your thoughts and let's unfold this story together. Maria stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the sink as Arthur Montero's words echoed in her ears. Marry me. It was a command, not a request. His voice was smooth but cold, as if he were negotiating a business deal rather than asking for a lifelong commitment. She turned to face him, her heart pounding against her ribs. Arthur leaned casually against the marble countertop, hands in his pockets, his piercing gaze locked onto her as if daring her to refuse. Excuse me? Maria finally managed to say, disbelief thick in her tone. Did I hear you right? You did, Arthur said matter-of-factly. I need a wife. You need money. It's a simple transaction. Maria's fingers tightened around the dish towel she held, her mind spinning. Of all the ridiculous things she had imagined happening to her, this was nowhere on the list. Arthur Montero, the impossibly wealthy, arrogant businessman who barely acknowledged her existence, was proposing marriage. Not out of love, not even out of attraction, but out of convenience. And a bet. Maria swallowed hard. Why me? Arthur tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating whether to tell her the truth. Then he simply shrugged. Because you're perfect for this. You're quiet, hardworking, and you don't belong in my world. Which makes this all the more interesting. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't naive. She had seen the way Arthur and his elite friends operated, how they treated people like her as invisible, unworthy of their time. Now, she was meant to be his wife? She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the weight of her reality pressed heavily on her chest. She thought of her younger siblings, still living with their aunt in a tiny apartment, barely scraping by. The money Arthur was offering would change everything for them. She could give them a better life, ensure their education, their future. You'll be compensated, Arthur continued, as if sensing her hesitation. A large sum, enough to wipe away any financial burden you have. 3 months of your life, and then you'll be free. Maria inhaled sharply. 3 months, a lifetime of security in exchange for 90 days. But at what cost? What happens after 3 months? She asked. Arthur's lips curved slightly, though it was far from a smile. We'll divorce, and you'll walk away a very wealthy woman. No attachments, no obligations. Maria glanced at the check he slid onto the counter, the numbers blurring before her eyes. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. More than she could ever hope to earn as a maid. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her family. I need time to think, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur's eyes darkened slightly, his expression unreadable. You have 24 hours. The next morning, Maria found herself standing in Arthur Montero's grand study, a marriage contract laid out before her. This outlines everything, Arthur said, his voice clipped and businesslike. You'll receive an immediate sum upon signing, and additional payments throughout the duration of the marriage. In return, you'll attend social events with me, play the role of my devoted wife, and abide by the conditions set forth. Maria's fingers trembled as she picked up the pen. She had spent the entire night weighing her options. But in the end, the choice had been clear. She wasn't doing this for herself, she was doing it for her family. Her signature scratched against the paper, sealing her fate. Arthur nodded in approval. The wedding is tomorrow. Maria's head snapped up. Tomorrow? I don't see the need to drag this out. Maria felt her stomach churn. There would be no engagement, no preparation, no time to come to terms with what she had just done. Arthur Montero was a man who moved swiftly, efficiently, without sentiment, and she was just another item on his agenda. The wedding was as cold and transactional as Maria had expected. It was held in a private ceremony at a high-end registry office, attended only by Arthur's lawyer and a handful of his business associates. There were no vows spoken in love, no warm embraces or whispered promises, just legal documents, a ring slid onto her finger with mechanical precision, and a kiss that barely touched her lips before Arthur pulled away. Maria sat stiffly in the back of the limousine as they drove to his estate, still in shock over how easily her life had been rewritten in a single day. She had stepped into a world she didn't understand, where wealth and power dictated everything, where love had no place. You'll live in the main house, Arthur said, breaking the silence. You'll be expected to attend charity galas, business dinners, and social gatherings. Your wardrobe will be handled by a professional stylist. If anyone asks, we met through a mutual friend, and it was love at first sight. Maria clenched her hands in her lap. And if I make a mistake? Arthur's expression didn't change. Then you corrected. Her chest tightened. There was no room for failure. The limousine pulled up to the massive Montero estate, and Maria's breath caught. She had worked in this house for years. But walking through the grand entrance as Arthur Montero's wife felt entirely different. The staff, who had once been her colleagues, now regarded her with quiet confusion, unsure how to treat her. Her room, no, her suite, was larger than any home she had ever lived in. Lavish furniture, a walk-in closet filled with designer gowns, a bed so large she felt lost in it. Yet, despite the luxury surrounding her, she had never felt more out of place. Maria sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the gilded mirror across the room. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, dressed in an expensive gown, adorned with a ring that didn't belong to her. She had made a deal with the devil, and now, she had 3 months to survive in his world. What would you do if you were Maria? Could you endure a loveless marriage for financial security? Or would you walk away, even if it meant returning to a life of struggle? Maria's journey has just begun, and the challenges ahead will test her in ways she never imagined. But what neither she nor Arthur realize is that some deals don't end when the contract expires. Would you like to see what happens next? Stay tuned for the next chapter, and let us know your thoughts below. The days following Maria's unexpected marriage to Arthur Montero were nothing short of overwhelming. The grandeur of his world, the sheer vastness of wealth surrounding her, made it clear just how out of place she was. The mansion, with its towering columns and sprawling gardens, was no longer just her workplace, it was now her home. Yet, she felt like an outsider within its walls. Arthur wasted no time in laying out his expectations. The contract was clear. Maria would not just be his wife on paper, but she was to convincingly portray the role of a high society woman. That meant etiquette lessons, wardrobe overhauls, and an extensive education in the unspoken rules of the elite. Maria, stubborn and proud, resisted at first. She had never cared for luxury or the shallow pretense of high society. She had spent her life working hard, supporting her family, and living honestly. She had never pretended to be someone she was not, and she had no intention of starting now. But reality soon set in. This wasn't just about her pride. She had agreed to this arrangement to secure a future for her siblings. If she wanted to walk away at the end of 3 months with her dignity intact and her family cared for, she had to survive this world. And so, she found herself surrendering, however reluctantly, to Arthur's demands. Her transformation began with an intensive etiquette regimen. Every morning, Clara, an esteemed social coach handpicked by Arthur, arrived at the mansion to mold Maria into the ideal wife of a millionaire. Maria endured countless hours of instruction on posture, speech, and behavior. She learned which fork to use at a formal dinner, how to walk in towering heels without stumbling, and how to carry herself with the effortless grace that seemed second nature to women in Arthur's world. At first, Maria hated every second of it. She loathed the way Arthur watched her with cool detachment, his sharp gray eyes scrutinizing her progress like a businessman assessing an investment. He corrected her when she misstepped, never cruel but always distant, as if she were just another task on his to-do list. But Maria was no stranger to hardship. She had spent years fighting against the odds, and if this was just another battle, then she would fight it too. Slowly, she began to improve. She practiced late into the night, determined not to let Arthur or herself down. Clara noticed the change first. The way Maria's steps became surer. The way she carried herself with an air of confidence that hadn't been there before. Arthur noticed too. He would never admit it, but something about Maria's determination fascinated him. She wasn't like the women he had known, those who had been born into wealth, who moved through high society with an effortless entitlement. Maria fought for every inch of ground she gained, and Arthur found himself watching her more closely than he intended to. The first true test of her transformation came in the form of a charity gala, one of the most prestigious events of the year. Arthur had been invited as a guest of honor, and Maria was expected to attend by his side. The idea made her stomach churn. She knew that the moment she stepped into that ballroom, every pair of eyes would be on her, judging, whispering, waiting for her to fail. The night of the gala arrived sooner than Maria would have liked. Dressed in an elegant navy gown that Clara had painstakingly selected, Maria stood before the mirror, barely recognizing herself. The woman staring back at her looked poised, sophisticated, everything Maria had never been. Yet, beneath the expensive fabric and carefully applied makeup, she was still the same girl who had scrubbed floors and counted every penny to survive. Arthur entered the room then, his usual expression unreadable. He was dressed impeccably, his black tuxedo tailored to perfection. His gaze swept over Maria, lingering just a second too long. Something flickered in his eyes, approval? Surprise? Whatever it was gone before she could decipher it. "You're ready," he said simply, offering his arm. Maria hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The gala was every bit as overwhelming as Maria had feared. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the air heavy with the scent of perfume and champagne. Conversations were laced with artificial charm, polite yet laced with hidden barbs. Arthur moved through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing Maria as his wife. She felt the weight of scrutiny with every handshake, every assessing glance from the elegantly dressed guests. But she held her own. When Clarice Belmont, a socialite known for her ruthless gossip, commented on how refreshing it was to see Arthur with someone so unpolished, Maria smiled sweetly and responded, "It's even more refreshing to see a room full of people who assume wealth equates to refinement." Arthur smirked at that, a glimmer of amusement flashing in his eyes. He hadn't expected Maria to hold her ground so firmly. And he certainly hadn't expected to enjoy watching her do it. As the night wore on, Maria found herself relaxing, falling into the rhythm of polite conversation and carefully measured smiles. Arthur, ever the calculated businessman, observed her closely. He had expected her to stumble, to falter under the weight of high society's expectations. But instead, she was proving to be stronger, sharper, more resilient than he had anticipated. It unsettled him. When the gala finally ended and they returned to the mansion, Arthur turned to Maria in the dim light of the car. "You handled yourself well tonight." Maria arched a brow, exhaustion evident in her posture. Was that a compliment? A ghost of a smile tugged at Arthur's lips. It was an observation. Maria rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she stared out the window, watching the city blur past. She had survived the night. More than that, she had held her own. Maybe she didn't belong in Arthur's world, but she was starting to realize that she wouldn't let it break her either. As the weeks passed, the tension between them began to shift. The icy detachment Arthur had maintained started to thaw, replaced by something else, something neither of them fully understood. They still clashed, still pushed against each other's boundaries, but there was a growing respect between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that neither was as simple as the other had assumed. Arthur had set out to change Maria, to shape her into the perfect high society wife for the sake of a bet. But he hadn't accounted for one thing. Maria was changing him, too, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The tension in the Montero mansion had shifted. What had once been a cold, transactional arrangement had transformed into something neither Arthur nor Maria had expected. Their interactions, initially laced with indifference and formality, now held something deeper, something neither of them dared to name. Arthur found himself watching Maria more often than he admitted, and Maria, despite her best efforts, felt something thaw between them. But just as the walls between them were beginning to crumble, so too was the fragile peace they had unknowingly built. It happened on a night that had begun like any other. The Montero estate was hosting an extravagant charity gala, another event meant to showcase Arthur's influence and connections. Maria had grown accustomed to these gatherings. With each passing event, she had learned how to move through the crowd with practiced grace, how to answer questions with just the right amount of poise, how to meet the scrutiny of high society without flinching. She had become something Arthur never expected, a woman who could stand by his side without appearing out of place. And Arthur had changed, too. He no longer saw Maria as just a pawn in a game. He sought her company outside of these events, engaged in conversations about things that had nothing to do with their arrangement. He caught himself admiring her resilience, the fire in her eyes when she defended herself, the quiet strength she carried in a world that never wanted her to belong. It unnerved him, this shift, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge what it meant. Tonight, Maria was a vision in emerald silk, her presence commanding the room in a way that made Arthur's chest tighten with something close to pride. It was a stark contrast from the first day he had presented her to this world. And though she carried herself with elegance, Maria couldn't shake the lingering discomfort of knowing she was still a stranger in Arthur's world. The evening had been going smoothly, until Thomas Serrano made his entrance. Thomas had always been a specter lurking in the background of their arrangement. He was the one who had proposed the bet, the one who had doubted Arthur's ability to carry it through. And tonight, his arrival felt different, charged with something unseen but undeniably present. He sauntered through the ballroom, his usual smirk in place as he greeted Arthur with an air of amusement. "Arthur," he drawled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "I have to say, I'm impressed. You've played your role exceptionally well." Arthur stiffened. "Thomas." Thomas turned to Maria, his gaze appraising. "And you, my dear, have done a remarkable job of fitting in. I almost believed this little act myself." Maria frowned, sensing something off in his tone. "I don't know what you mean." Thomas let out a chuckle and turned his attention back to Arthur. "Come now, Montero. 3 months ago, you wouldn't have given this woman a second glance. And now look at you, bringing her to galas, having her sit at your table, pretending as if she's anything more than what she started as." Arthur's jaw clenched. Don't what?" Thomas feigned innocence. "Tell her the truth?" The room felt suddenly smaller. Maria's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. "What truth?" Thomas exhaled, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "Oh, Maria, did he not tell you?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to let the words cut. "You were never more than a bet." Silence fell like a hammer. Maria felt the floor tilt beneath her. "A bet?" Thomas gestured between himself and Arthur. "A harmless little wager." Arthur here was so confident that money could buy anything, even the ability to turn a nobody into someone fit for high society. "So I challenged him to marry someone outside of his world, to mold her into perfection. And you, my dear, were the perfect challenge." Maria's breath came in shallow gasps. She turned to Arthur, waiting for him to refute it, to say anything that would undo the weight of what Thomas had just revealed. But Arthur said nothing. He stood there, his face unreadable, his silence the only confirmation she needed. Maria's hands trembled as she set her glass down on the nearest table. "So that's what this was?" Her voice wavered, but she refused to let herself break. "Everything? The dresses, the lessons, the way you treated me, it was all just a game to you?" Arthur took a step forward, his expression shifting, but Maria held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't," she choked out. "Don't you dare try to explain this away." Arthur swallowed hard. "Maria." "No," she cut him off, her voice stronger this time. "I let myself believe, for one foolish moment, that maybe I had finally found something real in this world. That maybe you saw me, but I was nothing more than another one of your business deals. Wasn't I?" Arthur's chest tightened. He had never wanted to hurt her, never wanted to see that look in her eyes. But what could he say? The truth was there, laid bare for her to see. Thomas sighed dramatically. "Well, this has certainly been entertaining, I must say. Arthur, I didn't think you'd actually get this attached." Arthur shot him a glare that could kill. "Get out." Thomas smirked. "Gladly." With that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Arthur and Maria standing in the wreckage of what had just unfolded. The sounds of the gala faded into the background, drowned out by the pounding of Maria's heart. "I need to go," she whispered, turning toward the exit. Arthur moved instinctively, reaching for her wrist. "Maria, wait." She yanked her arm free, her eyes flashing with fury and heartbreak. "You don't get to stop me, Arthur." She turned and walked away, her posture stiff, her steps unwavering. Arthur watched as she disappeared into the night, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. The bet had been won, but he had lost something far greater. The next morning, Maria was gone. Her room was empty, the closet bare, as if she had never been there at all. Arthur stood in the doorway, staring at the untouched space, a hollowness settling in his chest. He had spent his life believing that emotions were nothing more than liabilities. That attachment was a weakness. But now, with Maria gone, he realized the truth. He had never wanted something more in his life. And now, it was too late. Maria walked through the streets, the chill of the early morning air biting at her skin. She had nowhere to go, no plan, nothing but the burning ache in her chest. She had survived far worse in life. But this this was different. Because for the first time, she had allowed herself to hope. And hope, she now realized, was the cruelest lie of all. As the city moved around her, Maria knew one thing for certain. She was never going back. The Grand Montero mansion, once filled with lavish parties and the laughter of the wealthy elite, now stood eerily silent. It had been weeks since Maria had left, but her absence still clung to the air, suffocating Arthur in ways he never thought possible. The once vibrant halls were now nothing more than cold, empty corridors, echoes of a life that had shattered the moment she walked out the door. Arthur Montero was a man who had always prided himself on control. He had controlled his wealth, his reputation, and the people around him with an iron will. But now, he was utterly powerless. No amount of money, no carefully crafted business deal, could undo the pain he had caused. He had won countless battles in boardrooms, but he had lost the one thing that mattered most: Maria. Every night, he found himself in his study, drowning in glass after glass of whiskey. The expensive liquor burned his throat, but it did nothing to dull the ache in his chest. He would sit by the fireplace, staring into the flames as if they held the answer to his torment. The memories tormented him relentlessly: Maria's laughter, the way she would challenge him without fear, the quiet moments when she had started to trust him, and he had destroyed it all. Arthur ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his shirt unbuttoned and wrinkled from nights spent drinking alone. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles forming beneath them from lack of sleep. The pristine, calculated image of Arthur Montero had crumbled, revealing a man who was now haunted by his own reflection. Thomas's words still rang in his ears. The night Maria had discovered the truth, it was just a game to him. Maria, a bet. You were nothing more than a pawn. He had tried to stop Thomas, but the damage had already been done. Maria's face, pale and stricken with betrayal, was burned into his mind. She had looked at him as if he were a stranger, a monster. He had called her name, begged her to listen, but she had simply turned and walked away. And now he was left with nothing. Days passed in a blur. Arthur withdrew from society, from his business, from everything that had once defined him. He stopped attending high-profile events, ignoring the calls from his associates. His company ran on autopilot, his assistant handling everything as he lost himself in his misery. His staff whispered about his state, but no one dared to confront him. The Arthur Montero they had once known was unrecognizable. One evening, as he poured himself yet another drink, a soft knock at the door interrupted the silence. He ignored it at first, but when it came again, more insistent, he groaned and stood, running a hand over his tired face before opening it. His assistant, Marcos, stood there, holding an envelope. "You should see this," Marcos said hesitantly, handing it over. "It's from the charity organization Maria used to talk about." Arthur took the envelope, staring at it for a long moment before slowly opening it. Inside was a simple report, an update on the children's shelter Maria had always spoken about. The one she had dreamed of supporting, had worked so hard to contribute to before she ever met him. The shelter was struggling. Maria's name was listed under past donors, but Arthur knew she had left with almost nothing. She wouldn't have been able to help as much as she wanted to. A lump formed in his throat as he read through the document. These were children, orphans, struggling families, who needed help. And all this time, he had been drowning himself in self-pity while Maria had been out there, trying to make a difference in the world despite everything. He clenched his jaw, something stirring deep within him. Maria had once told him that money wasn't power. True power came from what a person did with their wealth, how they used it to create change. At the time, he had scoffed at her idealism. But now, he understood. The next morning, Arthur made his first public appearance in weeks. Dressed in a crisp suit, though still visibly exhausted, he arrived at his corporate headquarters and called an emergency board meeting. His executives murmured amongst themselves, surprised by his presence, but they fell silent as he spoke. I am donating $5 million to the children's shelter on behalf of the Montero Foundation, Arthur announced, his voice steady, effective immediately. The room erupted in murmurs. Arthur, one of his board members, began, "This is a generous contribution." But nothing. Arthur interrupted sharply, his gaze hard. This company has spent years building a legacy of wealth and power. It's time we start giving back. More donations followed. Arthur personally visited the shelter, meeting the children, seeing firsthand the lives Maria had wanted to change. He funded their education, their medical care, ensuring they had every opportunity to build a future. And yet, despite everything he was doing, one question lingered in his mind. Would Maria ever forgive him? He tried to find her, but she had disappeared from his world completely. He sent people to look for her, but all they found were dead ends. She wasn't at her old apartment. She had left no trace. Arthur, now more determined than ever, visited the places she had loved, the small coffee shop she used to frequent, the bookstore where she had once browsed for hours. He sat in those spaces, hoping, praying that one day, she might walk through the door. One night, after yet another fruitless search, he returned to the mansion and poured himself a drink. He stared at the glass for a long moment before setting it down with a heavy sigh. He had spent weeks trying to drown his sorrows, but alcohol had never been the answer. Maria had always faced her problems head-on. She had fought through hardship, through betrayal, without losing herself. And if he truly wanted to be a man worthy of her, he needed to do the same. Months passed, and Arthur continued his work, dedicating himself to charity, to helping others, to becoming the kind of man Maria would have respected. But every night, when he returned to his empty mansion, he still felt the hollowness of her absence. Then, one morning, Marcos entered his office with a hesitant expression. "We found her." Arthur's heart nearly stopped. "She's been working at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. She keeps to herself, but she's safe." Arthur rose from his chair, his pulse pounding. "Get the car," he said, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could finally breathe again. Would Maria be willing to see him? Could she ever believe that he had changed? Arthur knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could fight for a future. A future where, maybe, just maybe, he could prove to her that love wasn't just a bet. It was real, and it was hers. Would you like to see how this story unfolds? Share your thoughts and continue the journey with us. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, their ceaseless dance whispering secrets to the wind. The night sky stretched endlessly above, a canvas of ink with scattered pinpricks of light. Maria sat on the cool sand, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out at the horizon. The ocean had always been a place of solace for her, a silent witness to the thoughts she couldn't voice, the wounds she couldn't mend. The past few weeks had been a strange blend of liberation and emptiness. She had walked away from Arthur, from the betrayal that had shattered her trust. But in doing so, she had also walked away from the one person who had made her feel seen in ways she never expected. It was easier to pretend she had moved on. That was the logical thing to do, wasn't it? To cut ties, to heal, to build a life untainted by deception. But the heart was rarely as disciplined as the mind. She had avoided him. Each time she saw his name on her phone, she ignored it. When mutual acquaintances mentioned his name, she feigned indifference. But the truth gnawed at her like an open wound. Arthur Montero had changed, and she couldn't ignore it. Everywhere she turned, she saw proof of his transformation. The man who once thrived in a world of power and manipulation had poured his wealth into something meaningful. The charities, the community work, the outreach programs he was giving, not taking. He was trying to undo the damage he had caused, not just to her but to himself. And it tormented her because she didn't know what it meant for them. Tonight, she had come to the beach seeking answers. The waves swallowed her whispered confessions, but they offered no solace. The salt stung her skin as if urging her to let go. But of what? The pain? The past? Or the part of her that still wanted Arthur? A rustling noise from the dunes behind her broke the solitude. She turned sharply, her breath hitching as she saw the silhouette of a man staggering toward the shore. The moment he stepped into the moonlight, her heart stopped. Arthur. His usually impeccable attire was disheveled. His white shirt hung loose, buttons undone at the top, sleeves rolled up haphazardly. His dark hair was tousled, as though he had run his hands through it 1,000 times. Even from a distance, she could smell the alcohol on him. Her stomach clenched. Arthur Montero never lost control. He stopped a few feet from her, swaying slightly, his gray eyes clouded with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something raw. "Maria," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "You're real. I wasn't sure if you were just another dream." She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to steel her heart. "What are you doing here, Arthur?" He let out a breathless chuckle, stumbling slightly before finding his balance. "I could ask you the same thing, but I suppose you've always loved the ocean." His gaze drifted toward the horizon before snapping back to her. "Do you hate me?" Maria hesitated. Did she? She wanted to. God, it would be so much easier if she did. But hate was clean. What she felt for Arthur was anything but. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "That's fair. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't even know if I'd forgive me." She swallowed, her fingers digging into the sand. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her voice strained. "Why are you drunk, wandering the beach in the middle of the night?" He laughed, but it was a hollow, broken sound, "Because every time I close my eyes, all I see is you walking away. Every time I breathe, I wonder if you're somewhere thinking of me. Because I built an empire. But the moment you left, it felt like nothing." Maria's chest tightened. She had spent weeks convincing herself that she had imagined the change in him. That his guilt, his grand gestures, were nothing but an elaborate performance. But looking at him now, lost, desperate, vulnerable, she knew this was real. He took an unsteady step closer. "I love you, Maria. I love you in a way I never thought I was capable of loving anyone. And I know I don't deserve another chance. But I'm asking anyway." Her breath caught. The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. "Arthur," she whispered, shaking her head, "love isn't enough. Not when there's so much pain between us." He nodded, as if he had already known her answer. "Then tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix this. Tell me how to be the man you deserve." Tears burned her eyes. "I don't know." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. The wind howled around them, carrying their regrets into the night. Finally, Arthur took a step back, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "I'll wait, however long it takes." Maria watched as he turned, as he walked away into the darkness, his figure swallowed by the shadows. And for the first time since she had left him, she wasn't sure if she wanted him to disappear. Maria stood on the balcony of her small apartment, overlooking the ocean as the sun dipped below the horizon. The waves crashed against the shore in a rhythmic melody, echoing the turmoil within her heart. She had spent weeks wrestling with her emotions, torn between the past and the undeniable truth of the present. Arthur had changed, of that she was certain, but was change alone enough to erase the pain of betrayal? She traced the rim of her teacup absent-mindedly, her mind drifting back to the countless times she had seen Arthur in the papers. Not for his wealth or power, but for his relentless efforts to make a difference. He had turned the Montero fortune into something more than just a legacy of excess. The man who once saw the world as a playground for his ego now used his influence to help others. And Maria couldn't ignore the sincerity behind his actions. The sound of footsteps approaching startled her from her thoughts. Turning, She saw Arthur standing at the entrance to the balcony, his suit slightly disheveled as though he had rushed to find her. His eyes held a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "Maria," he breathed, stepping closer. "I've been looking for you." She held his gaze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Arthur, what are you doing here?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I couldn't stay away. Not anymore." He hesitated, then continued. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. Not after everything I've done. But I need you to know that my love for you is real. It was never supposed to be this way. I was a fool, Maria, a blind, arrogant fool who thought he had everything, only to realize too late that the one thing he truly needed was you." Tears welled in Maria's eyes as she listened, her emotions warring within her. "Arthur, do you understand how much you hurt me?" she whispered. "How much I wanted to believe that what we had was real, only to find out it started as a game?" Arthur took another step forward, his voice thick with emotion. "I do, and I will never forgive myself for it. But Maria, you changed me. You taught me that love isn't about power or control, it's about trust. About seeing the beauty in someone's soul. I don't deserve you, I know that, but if there's even the smallest part of you that still cares for me, let me prove to you that this love is real." Maria searched his face, looking past the sharp angles and tailored perfection, seeing the man beneath, the man who had fought to become someone better. And in that moment, she knew. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch his face. "Arthur," she murmured, "I forgave you a long time ago. I was just waiting to see if you could forgive yourself." His breath caught, his hands trembling as they came to rest on her waist. "Does that mean?" She smiled through her tears. "Yes, I love you, Arthur Montero, and I don't want to spend another day pretending that I don't." A tear slipped down his cheek before he pulled her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." The Montero estate had never shone as brilliantly as it did on the day of their wedding. A breathtaking garden, adorned with cascades of ivory roses and twinkling fairy lights, stretched before the grand hall. A golden arch stood at the end of the aisle, draped in silk and fresh blooms, framing the soft hues of the setting sun. Guests gathered in hushed admiration, whispering about the remarkable journey that had led them to this day. The once cold-hearted billionaire who had seen love as a mere transaction now stood at the altar, his heart laid bare before the woman who had unraveled him. Arthur's hands clenched at his sides as he watched Maria approach. She was a vision in white, an elegant, flowing gown that shimmered in the light, her hair cascading in soft waves, a tiara of delicate pearls adorning her head. But it wasn't the dress or the jewels that made her breathtaking, it was the quiet strength in her eyes, the love that radiated from within. When she reached him, he took her hands, his grip steady but reverent, as if holding the most precious thing in the world. The officiant began, but Arthur barely heard a word. His world had narrowed to the woman before him, the only thing that truly mattered. When it came time for his vows, he inhaled deeply, his voice steady yet brimming with emotion. "Maria, I have spent my life building an empire, chasing power, and believing that control was the only thing that mattered. But then you came into my life and shattered every illusion I had. You taught me that love isn't about winning, it's about surrender. And I surrendered to you, Maria, completely and without reservation. I promise to love you, to honor you, and to spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of the love you've given me." Maria's voice wavered with emotion as she spoke her vows. "Arthur, you were the last person I ever expected to love, and yet, you are the only person my heart has ever truly belonged to. I have seen the man behind the walls, the one who loves fiercely but fears it just as much. And I promise, with every part of me, to stand by your side, not as someone you bought into your world, but as your partner, your equal, and your greatest love." A hush fell over the guests as the officiant declared them husband and wife. Arthur didn't wait for permission. He pulled Maria into his arms and kissed her with every ounce of love he had, sealing their promise in a moment that would live forever in the hearts of all who witnessed it. As they turned to face their guests, the estate erupted in cheers. The air was filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses as friends and family celebrated not just a marriage, but the transformation of two souls who had found their way to each other against all odds. Maria leaned into Arthur's embrace as they swayed to their first dance, the world around them fading into a blur of candlelight and happiness. She had once believed love was something out of reach, but now she knew better. Love, when true, had the power to heal, to change, and to rewrite even the most unexpected of stories. As the night stretched on and fireworks lit up the sky above them, Maria rested her head against Arthur's chest, whispering softly, "We made it." Arthur pressed a kiss to her temple, holding her close. "Yes, we did. And this time, there were no bets, no contracts, only love. Love has the power to transform even the coldest of hearts." Arthur and Maria's journey proves that redemption is real, and that second chances, when truly earned, can lead to something more beautiful than either could have ever imagined. What do you think? Did Maria make the right choice? Would you have forgiven Arthur? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to celebrate love in all its forms, because, in the end, love always finds a way.